Yeah, I see him. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. So we can get started. If everyone would please mute their microphones. Hi, Mark. Glad to see you. This is the Global Justice Report. As you know, an online program of the Center for Global Justice. And I'm Betsy Bowman, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, also known as El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering the social economy, the social and solidarity economy. Since the end of the pandemic, we've adopted a hybrid form for our events, combining both in-person and online webinars to reach as much of our public as possible. If you're in San Miguel, you can attend our events in person at the Quinta Loreto Community Room every Monday at 1 p.m. For those of you who are out of town, you can participate online through our webpage, which is www.globaljusticecenter.org. The pandemic and the death of the other co-founder of the center, Cliff Duran, were a terrible trauma to all of us. And without our many events and trips that we normally have, our coffers are empty. So we depend on your donations to support these live webinars and to continue to pay our staff. So if you're able to, please donate online at our webpage. Today's program is about the 150th or 160th webinar. I'm not sure which. And since instituting these webinars, we've had 30 some odd views on our YouTube channel. So we're very proud of our outreach and educational programming. We're now resuming our educational trips to Cuba. If you want to go to Cuba and you don't want to get shunted over into the tourist traps, come with the Center for Global Justice and see the real Cuba. We're also resuming our educational trips to the Sierra Gorda, Chiapas, the cooperative network at Tosepan in the state of Puebla, and we're resuming our student group visits and internships here in San Miguel. So please consider joining one of our trips or bring your students to visit San Miguel. Possibly the best antidote to the anti-immigrant sentiment that is sweeping the United States and many parts of the world is a visit to Mexico. You know, come see what's really happening here. We will be having, our next program will be in 2 weeks. And on September 11th, next Monday, of course, is Labor Day, so we're skipping that. And on 9/11, it's an appropriate date for this topic by our colleague here, Gregory Diamond, on apocalyptic anxiety and the rumbles of discontent, the alienation effect. I guess the program committee decided to put that on September 11th, just on purpose. A week after that, on September 18th, we're going to have a program on regenerative agriculture with Ercilia Soares, who works with Via Organica here in San Miguel. Now, Bob Stone is going to actually introduce Cynthia to you. So I'll ask him, Christina, I'm sorry. I'll ask him to come to the podium now.
Well, I am very honored and
Speak up. Speak louder.
especially privileged to introduce Christina Heatherton. She is an American Studies scholar and historian of anti-racist social movements, topics and areas very dear to all of you in our audience and beyond. She is author of Arise, exclamation point, subtitle, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. This is no less than a rediscovery and reintroduction of a historical event through the lives of internationalists it has affected. And I commend it to all of you. This highly praised rediscovery of the Mexican Revolution will be our focus here. Professor Heatherton has also written on history's first successful slave revolt in the War of Independence for Haiti. And she is co-editor of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter. So she addresses racism and other related matters frontally. Welcome, Christina. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Let's start. I want to ask you to please give us a talk of whatever length you choose, and we'll put questions to you afterwards if we may. Andale. Okay, my friend, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I am so grateful to be joining you all. Thank you to Liz and Bob and Betsy for coordinating this, and thanks to everybody for showing up today on the call. I really wish I could be joining you in San Miguel de Allende. There's a really close connection actually to that place, and the cover of my book, Arise, the image some of you might recognize is by the radical artist Elizabeth Catlett. She was part of the Taller de Gráfica, the Taller de Gráfica Popular, which was an internationalist art collective in Mexico City that I write about. Catlett was the target of McCarthyite repression in the 40s. And so from the late 40s until her death in 2012, she lived in Mexico. And as many radicals have written about, she helped people find refuge when they were fleeing repression around the world, whether it was fascism in Franco's Spain, other victims of McCarthyism, or victims of racist repression in the United States through programs like COINTELPRO. So in 2011, I visited her at her home in Cuernavaca, and I talked to her and her son about this history. They told me a lot about some of the radicals who passed through, including Harry Haywood, who was famously the author of Black Bolshevik, who was one of the people who sought refuge with her. Haywood's former wife, Dr. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, lived in San Miguel de Allende up until her death last year. I don't know how many of you know Dr. Hall. She was a very significant figure, a prolific historian of slavery. I have a feeling I'm speaking to some of her friends and comrades around here, but for those who don't know, a prolific historian of slavery in the Caribbean, Latin America, particularly in Louisiana and throughout the Americas. I did an oral history with Dr. Hall before she died in 2022. She talked to me about Elizabeth Catlett. She talked about the radical circles in Cuernavaca, and also really impressively, how Elizabeth Catlett helped her discover her own political footing. And she invited me to come visit her. I really regret that I was not able to come. So I just wanted to start by saying your city holds a very special place in my heart. It means a lot to be speaking with you today, and I hope to visit one day. So that's where I wanted to start. I'm going to share my screen. Let me say a few things about this book before we get into it. So give me a thumbs up if you can all see brightly. Yeah, cool. I see 2 thumbs. Awesome. So let me say a few things about this book, Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. The first thing that I want to say is that it was published in October 2022 in the US, and this coming October 2023, it will be translated into Spanish and published in Mexico on La Cigarra Press. And I'll be visiting Mexico City, Oaxaca, and Pueblo to talk about the book in October. I'm really excited about that. So this is a book about internationalism. It's about internationalism related to the Mexican Revolution. And, a lot of people ask me, just the other day, I was talking to a young man from Canada who said, why don't we know so much about internationalism related to the Mexican Revolution? We know about, say, the international brigades related to the Spanish Civil War, but why don't we know more about Mexico and its relationship to internationalism? And I want to say there's a long academic answer that I can give that I'd be happy to give, but I just want to emphasize that I think the answer is primarily political, especially for those of us that are located in the United States and the global North. We know deliberately very little about Mexico and Mexican history here, and I think this is deliberate obfuscation. The U.S. maintains ongoing relations of extraction, displacement, exploitation, and debt regimes in relationship to Mexico. We are made of Mexican land, labor, capital, and political ideas. And so the idea that its history has nothing to do with our own is nothing but pure racism. What I hope to show is that the things that we might understand as U.S. radicalism, as well as global radicalism, global histories of struggle and resistance, were often influenced by radical currents related to Mexico and its revolution in more complicated ways than we might imagine. And I believe that these histories are very important for the way that we fight and organize today. So the key idea for me in this book, my key concept is convergent space. These are socio-spatial sites where people from different backgrounds and different radical traditions have been forced together and have produced new articulations of struggle together, which is maybe just a kind of fancy way of saying that people come together, they have, as they still do, with different experiences, different histories, different radical lineages, and they make sense of the world with the tools available when they are organizing together, when they are fighting together. Often they produce new ideas and new theories of struggle in the process. I'm really interested in how that happens and the spaces in which that happens. So the book is organized according to the making of different spaces. So each chapter is kind of organized around a different convergent space. So for example, just to kind of give you a flavor for the book, chapter 3, How to Make a University, looks at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, where during World War I, Mexican revolutionaries, wobblies, pacifists, communists, as well as working class soldiers of empire taught and learned from each other and organized together, and in the process thought anew about revolution and practices of internationalism. Chapter 4, How to Make Love, thinks about the travels of Alexandra Kollontai, who between 1926 and 1927 was a Soviet ambassador to Mexico. And I'm really interested there in the way that she and other feminists reimagines relations of gender, sexuality, and the organization of the family in their conceptions of state and revolution. Chapter 5, How to Make a Living, examines Mexican farm workers and their families in rural Southern California towns and how they were connected to urban organizing efforts, largely led by women against starvation, unemployment, and eviction in cities like Los Angeles. And I'm interested in how they were influenced by the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. Finally, How to Make a Dress, chapter 6, is the chapter that's about Elizabeth Catlett, the artist I mentioned earlier. This chapter is situated in the 1930s and 40s, and there the radical convergent spaces I'm thinking about are art collectives that were located in places like Harlem, Chicago, and Mexico City. And as the conclusion, How to Make History argues, I believe this history still has a lot to teach us at present. So for today's talk, I'm going to do a kind of short abbreviated reading of some of the introduction, which is called How to Make a Rope. So let me drink some water and I'll go ahead and get started. The Ideal Rope, explained the Upson Walton Company in their 1902 booklet, achieves a tension so perfect that if a heavy weight were attached to one end, pulling the rope to its full length, quote, the weight would not turn. For such a weight, an industrialist of the period might envision loads of grain, barrels of oil, or freights of precious minerals. For a rancher, bales of wool or bundles of leather might stretch the imaginary cables. The shipper might picture cargo drawn high above the ocean, then lowered gently without rotation onto the docks below. Ropes, of course, were commonly enlisted into more nefarious service. Coiled, tangled, or laid flat, each length was potent with malice, 13 simple twists away from becoming a noose. In the Jim Crow era of vigilante violence and sexual warfare, ropes could fasten commodities as easily as they might bind arms, break necks, or strain against the turning weight of a human body. Neither the mining owner, the shipping magnate, nor the commercial rancher would expect to see such grisly functions portrayed in trade brochures, and nor would they need to. As the history of the 19th century had already proven, the means of securing capital were often indistinguishable from the mechanisms of organizing racist terror. In November 1871, the Chicago Tribune published an eyewitness account of such terror. 3 Black men, Squire Taylor, who was 45, George Johnson, who was 39, and Charles Davis, who was 68, were kidnapped from a county jail by the Ku Klux Klan and lynched in Charleston, Indiana. Aware that a, quote, impending mob was coming that night, the reporter arranged to sleep in the sheriff's office, ensuring that he was, quote, awake at the hour of the contemplated violence. When the Klan did arrive, the sheriff refused to unlock the cell doors. The mob proceeded to bludgeon the jail bars with axes, sledgehammers, and chisels, quote, white heat sparks following every blow. The reporter observed how the Klansmen's eyes, quote, seemed to glow through their masks like those of famished wolves. For nearly 4 hours, Taylor, Johnson, and Davis were trapped, watching in silence as the locks before them were battered, their executioners pounding and panting without restraint. Around 2 a.m, the sheriff decided to put an end to the jail's structural damage. He retrieved the keys from their hiding place in the back of the building. Knotted on a piece of string and anchored to a window bar, the keys swung between the jail's outer walls and the bleak expanse of night. The Tribune's article, which I hope you can all see, was entitled Mask and Manila. The mask, of course, referred to the Klan's muslin hoods, while Manila referenced the, quote, brand new whitish-brown ropes that had been used to hang the men. Each rope, it noted, had been prepared in advance with a noose, quote, showing that someone was at work who understood his business. Manila, a fiber that Filipinos called abaca, was a derivative of the plantain plant. The fibrous bark was ideal for rope, making it one of the most valuable indigenous products of the archipelago, according to mid-19th century trade guides. Royal Spanish galleons sailing between colonial port cities in the Philippines and Mexico had used Manila rope for their rigging. Found to be sturdier, less likely to mold, or to be eaten by insects, Manila imports to the United States grew precipitously after 1850, soon replacing other imported fibers like Indian jute and Russian hemp. When the abolitionist John Brown was captured in 1859, trying to spark an armed insurrection of enslaved people in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, Southern states actually competed to deliver the rope to hang him. Kentucky's hemp rope ultimately beat out South Carolina's rope of cotton. Manila soon surpassed all these domestically grown fibers. By the turn of the century, Manila was the most popular rope-making fiber in the United States, and as headlines suggested, it was nearly synonymous with rope itself. The 1902 rope booklet observed that a surplus of Manila fiber was, quote, brought into our lap following the 1898 Spanish-American War and Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902. With those wars, the United States seized imperial control over the Philippines, obtaining a near monopoly over the country's exports, 2/3 of which consisted of Manila. Though demand for rope-making fiber soared, especially after it was deemed strategic war material, the sustainability of the abaca supply was soon cast into doubt. The user of Manila hemp, quote, reasoned the Waterbury Company in its 1920 catalog, is, quote, dependent entirely upon our foreign possessions in the Far East. And this fraught dependence meant that, quote, the procuring of hemp for rope making is attended to with some difficulty. Indeed, U.S. reliance on Manila was imperiled as Filipino workers and rebels fiercely resisted U.S. imperial policies, just as they had overthrown Spanish colonial rule, from which U.S. governing practices were adapted. Catalogs of U.S. cordage companies in the early 20th century attest to this industrial and geopolitical crisis. They agree that no solution could be found in a so-called domestic market. Rather, for a profitable, plentiful, and stable supply of rope-making fiber, U.S. industrialists had only to look south of their border. While Manila imports declined, U.S. imports of Mexico's rope-making fibers, henequen and sisal, exploded. Primarily used as agricultural twine to bind bushels of grain and bales of hay, henequen and sisal were easily joined with other fibers to make ropes of varying widths and strengths. Derived from the spiny agave cactus, the fibers, both of which were often described as henequen, grew plentifully in the southernmost Mexican state of the Yucatan, a product of its hot, dry climate, its flat landscape, and the unrelenting input of its indigenous labor force. Beginning in the 1870s, landless Maya Indians had been conscripted to work on henequen plantations or haciendas after their commonly held lands were expropriated by the state under the regime of President Porfirio Diaz. Consigned to debt peonage, the Maya had little choice but to accept labor contracts that could be sold or traded among local Yucatecan henequen capitalists or henequeneros, though rarely ever paid off. Locked into debt, henequen workers faced brutal conditions, long hours, and regular lashings with henequen whips. Henequeneros justified the beatings with the adage, "Los indios no oyen, sino por las nalgas." The Indians only hear with their asses. In addition to injury, exhaustion, and disease, many Maya also succumbed to epidemics of suicide. In 1909, British travel writers insisted that the henequen labor regimes had cracked the indigenous workforce on a, quote, wheel of tyranny so brutal, the heart of them is dead. As demand for henequen fiber boomed, henequeneros conspired with federal Mexican officials to capture workers from around the country. In a coordinated plan called El Enganche, or the Hook, thousands of war deserters, prisoners, vagrants, and political dissidents, including Huastec Indians from Veracruz and Yaqui Indians from the northern border, were ensnared. Hunted by the Mexican government as well as by U.S. officials, Yaquis were sent to the Yucatan haciendas in chains, declared by Diaz to be, quote, obstinate enemies of civilization. 2/3 of the Yaquis subsequently died. Barbarous labor conditions meant shortened lives for the workers and high turnover rates for the henequeneros. Between 1878 and 1910, labor recruiters added an additional 10,000 contract workers from Cuba, Italy, Spain, the Canary Islands, China, Japan, and Java, including nearly 3,000 from Korea. Enclosed by barbed wire, disciplined by overseers, and dependent on tiendas de raya, or company stores, which often had jail cells attached to them, henequen plantations were effectively transformed into a vast federal prison for indentured segments of the global working class and so-called indios bárbaros, or hostile Indians. Through debt and corporal punishment, henequen workers were forced to accept hunger, unsanitary conditions, and insufficient medical care for their children. Records reveal that women were routinely coerced into relationships with henequeneros, ensuring that the threat of rape or compulsory sexual arrangements menaced every hacienda. Out of these brutal regimes, a motley international force of the criminalized, the violated, and the expropriated produced the raw material of 20th century rope. Now, no other company benefited from Yucatecan henequen more than the Chicago-based McCormick Harvesting Company. McCormick sold agricultural machines that harvested grain and bound it into sheaves using henequen binder twine. These reaper binder machines scaled up commercial production, enabling agribusiness in the Midwest U.S. to explode. Such explosions occurred alongside the intensified expropriation of indigenous land. Laws like the 1887 Dawes Act privatized millions of acres of communally held tribal lands in the region, enabling their settlement and agglomeration for capitalist agriculture. Through new reaper binder technology and ongoing settler colonial violence, Native territories in the Midwest were transmorgified into the nation's so-called breadbasket. With JP Morgan's financial backing, McCormick absorbed several major competitors, becoming International Harvester, or IH, in 1902. IH investors learned that a blend of Philippine abaca and Mexican henequen made ideal binder twine for Midwest grain, and they quickly invested in the Yucatan. By 1910, IH owned 99.8% of the entire Yucatecan fiber trade. In Chicago, as in the Yucatan, millionaires pressed wealth from the tangles of international misery. Aware of growing concerns over the Yucatan's labor conditions, IH officials addressed the problem in a 1910 issue of their company magazine, writing, quote, "There is nothing in the nature of slavery in the Yucatan. Every man is free and receives his pay as regularly as the workman in American factories," unquote. The statement, of course, was unwittingly ironic, given that workers had famously protested labor conditions against McCormick Chicago factories where the reaper binder machinery was made. Demanding an 8-hour day with no cut in pay, McCormick's iron molders had joined thousands of Chicago workers and tens of thousands nationally on a general strike on May 1st, 1886, organized by the industrial union, the Knights of Labor. On May 3rd, 2 striking McCormick workers were killed by the police. The next day, demonstrators poured into Chicago's Haymarket Square in protest. A bomb went off during the rally, and police responded by firing into the crowd. When the dust settled, several men were dead and over 100 were injured. 8 high-profile labor activists were arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder. All 8 were convicted in a show trial that was designed to intimidate organized labor. 4 of the Haymarket organizers, August Spies, Albert Parsons, Adolph Fisher, and George Engel, were executed in a gruesome public hanging. Before he was hung, Spies shouted from the platform, quote, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." If the Knights of Labor had organized under the slogan, "An injury to one is the concern of all," Haymarket demonstrated the maxim's global resonance. Around the world, the 1st of May became known as Industrial Workers' Day, or May Day. In 1913, the Yucatan-based Casa del Obrero Mundial organized Mexico's first major May Day demonstration, complete with the Haymarket commemoration. Later, Mexican laws declared the day a, quote, "cause of pride, not only for the proletariat of the United States, but for the whole world." Writing from Mexico City in 1921, veteran labor organizer Mary Mother Jones bore witness to this solidarity. Jones was shocked to see Mexican workers enter the hall carrying the Mexican flag alongside a banner dedicated to the Chicago martyrs. The honor, said Jones, was, quote, "the most remarkable demonstration I had witnessed in all my years in industrial conflict." To this day, May Day in Mexico is celebrated as the day of Chicago, of the martyrs of Chicago. From their brutal harvest in the Yucatan to the hanging of the Haymarket organizers and back, ropes interlinked circuits of capital and empire, as well as the swell of international resistance rising against them. Ropes, in the tumultuous first decades of the 20th century, were often curious composites of coexisting global regimes of accumulation. Manila from U.S. imperial control over the Philippines, cotton or domestically produced hemp from brutal Jim Crow sharecropping regimes, and henequen produced through the violent exploitation of expropriated indigenous peasants and an indebted, dispossessed global proletariat. A further understanding of the financing, the property regimes, the expropriation, the policing, along with the transport, storage, processing, consumption, and destruction of this raw material would reveal a vast interlocking universe of exploitation, expropriation, and oppression. Ropes, the ligatures of the global economy, materialize the processes by which the lives of people across disparate spaces are densely interwoven. A social history of ropes demonstrates that when capitalism links spaces, it also links the fates of people compelled into its regimes of accumulation. As Peter Linebaugh writes in his landmark study of crime in 18th century London, The social history of hanging must, quote, also be an economic history of the trades and working conditions of its victims. Accordingly, a full accounting of the forces that set value in motion requires a global analysis of capital and a social history of its antagonists. Ropes through such a socio-spatial and economic history can illuminate the movement of capital, commodities, and labor, as well as the bonds shared by Yucatecan peasants, Chicago labor organizers, dispossessed Native people, victims of Jim Crow terror, and others who might otherwise be untraceable within discretely imagined national, racial, or ethnic histories. Unbraiding the strands of the accumulation process exposes obscured histories of solidarity and evinces possible futures of shared struggle. Ropes, in other words, help demonstrate how capital, geography, and histories of opposition converge. They illustrate how people have been concretely conjoined across space and how they have consequently understood their fates as interlinked in a global class struggle. The rope, therefore, that lynched Mexican rancher Antonio Rodriguez in Rock Springs, Texas on November 3rd, 1910, was tied to broader global regimes of butchery and wider currents of resistance. This rope that had bound Rodriguez to a mesquite tree, that prevented his escape as he was covered with dry branches and doused with gasoline, the rope that trussed him as he was burned alive before a gaping mob of thousands. This rope, a tool of the man's trade, became a racist and gendered instrument of imperialist class power. Rodriguez was accused of killing his boss's wife, Effie Henderson. The charge came from the boss himself, a man with an established record of violence against the woman. Like Squire Taylor, George Johnson, Charles Davis, and many, many others before him, Rodriguez was kidnapped from his jail cell by a mob of white vigilantes intent on exacting their own justice. Without trial or due process, Rodriguez was set on fire and killed beneath an endless Texas sky. A flurry of U.S. newspapers vindicated Rodriguez's killers, hailing a common defense of lynching, the so-called protection of white womanhood. Lynchings were not merely forms of racist terror, but as Ida B. Wells had argued, they were also bloody rituals of aspirational authority. Lynching symbolically affirmed an order wherein white men were by law the dominant owners, heirs, and sellers of property and capital, whether or not they actually possessed property or capital themselves. This order manifested at regional, national, and international levels. The killing of Rodriguez, a Mexican foreign national, constituted a brazen flouting of international law. Less than 100 miles from the US-Mexico border, his murder represented a totality of racist terror, state power, and socio-spatial control codified through notions of gender, class, nationality, and race. The rope that killed Antonio Rodriguez was, in other words, a color line. But the rope that killed Antonio Rodriguez also drew together measures of national and international outrage. Mexican commentators challenged the moral authority of the United States. Quote, progress, civilization, culture, humanitarianism, wrote revolutionary Mexican agitator and journalist Praxedes Guerrero, were ideals that were smothered in the smoke rising from Rodriguez's, quote, charred bones. Guerrero poignantly located Rodriguez's lynching, quote, on that same piece of land that has still not escaped the shadow cast by the hanging of John Brown. Demonstrators rallied in defense of Rodriguez across the U.S. and internationally in countries like Mexico and Cuba. Enraged leaders began calling for a boycott of U.S. goods. Mexican demonstrators rallied at the offices of U.S. newspapers and businesses, at the home of the U.S. ambassador, and in the streets, often while under fire from Mexican troops. On November 12, 1910, Mexican revolutionary leader Ricardo Flores Magón described the, quote, explosion of indignation rocking Mexican cities in response to the lynching. In his internationally circulating newspaper, Regeneración, Flores Magón described how Mexican protesters had condemned Rodriguez's murder, as well as the racist violence committed against Mexican people in the United States. For Flores Magón and other Latin American commentators, this killing was in keeping with the violent encroachment of U.S. imperialism and the avaricious behavior of U.S. capitalists. It was racism that killed Rodriguez, and as Flores Magón noted, quote, it is capitalism that foments racial hatred. On November 20th, 1910, not long after Rodriguez's death and the international protest against it, the Mexican Revolution officially broke out. During this first major social revolution of the 20th century, the economic geography of the lynch rope would unravel, and the politics of the color line would throb at the heart of the global class struggle. So this book, Arise, maybe I'll stop my share here and just say a few more things. This book, Arise, observes how revolutionary thinkers like Ricardo Flores Magón were uniquely positioned to understand how capital crossed national borders, exploited workers and peasants, and linking the destinies of those it dispossessed. Following their lead, it foregrounds the influence of the Mexican Revolution, the first major social revolution of the 20th century. So while ropes are not the subject of the book, they serve to illustrate its stakes and its scope. They also help illuminate some of the key challenges to depict the class struggle in motion over time, between scales, and across space. The book considers how interpretations of internationalism were conditioned by shifts in the political geographies of global capital accumulation. It argues that in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was the emergence of a distinct form of geoeconomic imperial power, what W.E.B. Du Bois described as the, quote, new imperialism. Under this model, states not only pursued imperial expansion through overt and formalized territorial annexations, but also through more insidious dominance through financial control, debt regimes, and threatened militarism. So rather than simply installing a foreign government or practicing direct administration in countries where states sought land, labor, raw materials, or strategic geopolitical locations, investors exerted dramatic financial control over sites of investment and subsequently ensured those with the threat or actuality of military intervention. So while territorialism and capitalism cross-fertilized one another throughout the British Empire, in the emergent U.S. model of hegemony, they were, in Giovanni Arrighi's words, indistinguishable. In the late 19th and early 20th century, U.S. capitalist forces developed the capacities to dictate the terms through which capital was administered, governed, managed, and dispensed on a global scale. In Latin America and the Caribbean, U.S. models of capitalist power were refined, with the deepest and most devastating advances initially made in Mexico. So while the Mexican Revolution is often understood as a contained nationalist event, the allied struggle of the Mexican working class and peasantry was largely mobilized against the domination by foreign capital over the national political economy and the dramatic transformations of property ownership and state power. It's important to mention that within these transformations, the U.S. occupied an increasingly decisive role. It was in Mexico that the U.S. first became a creditor nation. By the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, the American capitalist class owned more than 22% of Mexico's surface, accounting for nearly a quarter of all U.S. investment and exceeding the total holdings of Mexican entities. Conglomerates like the International Banking Corporation, the first U.S. multinational bank, emerged in Mexico in 1902, facilitating U.S. investments in Mexican government bonds, mining, oil, agriculture, and other industries. These profits further capitalized U.S. ventures in China, India, Panama, the Philippines, and the Dominican Republic, a capitalist infrastructure that was later formalized and fortified by U.S. state policy. The U.S.'s relationship to Mexico, I argue, would therefore play a major part in its emergence during this era of the new imperialism. Because the Mexican Revolution threatened specific material investments, as well as the logic of the period, it challenged this model of the new imperialism and the growing hegemony of the United States therein. Mexico is therefore a prime site within which the shifting logics of capital, labor, and revolution could be thought anew. Indeed, as the book observes, from the vantage point of the Mexican Revolution, the internationalization of capital produced a decidedly internationalist consciousness. So the challenge for organizers and theorists has long been to understand the conjoined but distinct forms of oppression under capitalism, and crucially, the ways in which struggles between them have been linked. In other words, the process of uniting people in shared struggle across spaces of difference is certainly not as easy or straightforward as simply expecting the workers of the world to unite. in relating exploited industrial workers to expropriated indigenous people of the Americas, to African people dispossessed of their lands, enslaved within plantocracies, and later subjugated under Jim Crow, colonial subjects concentrated in space and brutally conscripted into extractive economies, and people subjected to military occupation and imperial rule, as well as all the convergences between them, requires some theoretical elaboration. So this book offers a framework to broaden the way the revolutionary subjects of history are recognized and also expand the ways that capital itself is understood and contested. Arise draws from the insights of people like Frederick Douglass, like W.E.B. Du Bois, like Ricardo Flores Magón, to describe struggles over the production of space and the territoriality of power in the early 20th century. It argues that antagonisms in and over the production of capitalist space have constituted the basis of the global class struggle. And I just want to say, in doing so, the book tries to avoid the narrowing tendencies in the history of what we often call in this country, so-called American radicalism, namely to de-link and make discrete different struggles as singularly national, sectoral, ethnic, or racially bound. Such particularizing might lend itself to clear exposition, but often at the cost of understanding the astounding ways class struggles have been understood and collectively fought out by people on the move. This book seeks instead to describe how differently situated people were often thrown together in unexpected ways, and in how in those tumultuous convergences, people fought, they made new meaning, they took overt and sometimes subtle inspiration from one another, a more dynamic history of struggle that I believe can enliven our sense of 20th century revolution and possibilities at present. So thank you.
Heard, I guess.
You are heard.
Okay, there we go. Well, thank you so much. This was illuminating, and I want to start by asking a question that came to me when I read your piece for the Cambridge book on American history, your treatment of the Haitian Revolution, which you date from, or the beginnings of which you date from 1791. And I wonder if there isn't a similar method there where you find in the metaphor of the rope, although the metaphors are different, the weaving of an international resistance to the lynching rope. It seems to me that there's the dating of calling the Russian Revolution the first socialist revolution of the of history is Eurocentric. I want to suggest that you have talked about both of these revolutions, the Haitian and the Mexican, with a similar methodology, taking the product or the labor, yielding the product that becomes a commodity with blood on it to markets wherever. That we really should be starting our revolutionary history with things like the Haitian Revolution and the Mexican Revolution. What do you think of that?
Okay, I'm going to take myself off mute, so I hope that doesn't interfere with the sound. So Bob, thank you so much for that question. And you don't always get a question that says, hey, you know, I I read this other thing that you wrote and I thought it was a pretty good, it was in conversation with this other thing you wrote. You never get that question. So I appreciate you referencing that. And I think the way you laid it out in the question, I probably couldn't have phrased it better myself. I think at the heart of your question is this question about like, how do we understand internationalism, right? And I think, as I mentioned before, there are some flashpoints that I think are somewhat convenient in terms of how we define it. I think for a lot of people, the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War stands out as an example of internationalism. And certainly the Bolshevik Revolution is the key event through which we understand internationalism. So in the book, and also in the article that you mentioned, I do try to talk about the Haitian Revolution, to be able to say, now what happens to the way that we define internationalism if we don't start from those events in the 20th century? In fact, like, even though I'm talking about the era of the Mexican Revolution, I argue that we have to go back to the Haitian Revolution to really understand the definition of internationalism that I'm trying to call upon. And so part of my argument is that if we can trace a trajectory of internationalism from the Haitian Revolution, if we can begin to define internationalism in that way, the way, abolitionists of the period did. It's not like we're reinventing the wheel. I spend a lot of time thinking with Frederick Douglass in that chapter, who's thinking about Mexico, who's thinking about the Haitian Revolution. He has a global vision of abolition that I feel like really undergirds my own understanding of internationalism. And so, this is the scaffolding with which I'm thinking about the era of the Mexican Revolution. But you're absolutely right. In order to get to that definition, first, we have to displace some of the common ways that we imagine internationalism as being this 20th century phenomenon that begins with either the Spanish Civil War or the Bolshevik Revolution. So yes, so that's my answer. Yes.
Just to follow up.
Let me put myself on mute.
We've had a debate inside of the Center for Global Justice comparing settler colonialism as practiced in the United States and settler colonialism as practiced in Mexico. And if you make that comparison, which I'm asking you to explore briefly, U.S. doesn't come out so good. What do you think of that? Well,
I mean, the U.S. doesn't come out so good in anything that I write. So if my answer before was yes, my answer this time is no. I mean, I think there's such important work being done, particularly by Indigenous scholars who are trying to reframe our understanding of all political thought within a context of settler colonialism and thinking in a broad global way about how, we reimagine different contexts and, settler colonialism in different countries, how they inflected one another, how they were at odds with each other sometime. And so, I thought that it was very important to emphasize the conjoined struggle of Indigenous people against dispossession in both contexts, because I think that often in the way we imagine, particularly U.S. radicalism, we reproduce a lot of the settler colonial tropes as if, there were just hardworking people on the frontier and there was nobody there before, and there was no violence in producing that frontier. And so I think our understanding of revolution and of capitalism changes, when we think deeply with Indigenous people and Indigenous studies scholars.
Thank you. We both read Adolfo Healy and his thesis that the Mexican Revolution was interrupted. If it was interrupted, please comment on that. Where does it stand now, and how do we understand, for example, the fourth transformation as the present Mexican president characterizes his ambition?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I feel like that's a question I should be asking you all and how you understand that, particularly because I know that that's something that you're all thinking very deeply about. I will say that one thing that I've been very intrigued by was, this year in Mexico is the year of Pancho Villa. Last year was the year of Ricardo Flores Magón. And I watched some of AMLO's press conference announcing this. It was like very early in January. And, there was all the expected kind of pageantry. There was a banner unfurled of Flores Magón. But I was also very intrigued at the same time that the families that have been organizing around the disappearance of the Ayotzinapa students have constituted themselves in a practice that I think is longstanding from the rural school in a committee called the Ricardo Flores Magón Committee. And it's through this that they are agitating and organizing in order to first find their children and friends and comrades, and then to demand justice. And so, where does the Mexican Revolution live today? I think that somewhere in this tension between like the ways in which the heroes of the revolution, such as Ricardo Flores Magón, confront these kind of grassroots memories and longstanding traditions, through which people continue to organize. Somewhere in that confrontation, I believe, is where the Mexican Revolution lives today. But it's genuinely a question I would have for all of you on the call and how you think about that.
Well, we've been asked a question by our speaker, worth thinking about, and please comment. Let me just ask a simple question. I'm a reader of La Jornada, the only left-wing daily in North America. What is the relation of La Jornada to Regeneración? Was it a daily?
That's a very, very good question. A person's got to admit when they don't know. I haven't traced those two histories. I'm sure that there was obviously recognition of each other. At a certain period, they would have been publishing at the same time. But I would have to go back into the archive and think about who was writing, where they were publishing, what kind of overlap they had, before thinking about whether there was a relationship between the things that they were publishing. I will say that I think it absolutely surprises a lot of readers in North America when I talk about Regeneración, when I talk about this newspaper that was written by a Mexican revolutionary. And I ask people, where do you think it was published? They say, I don't know, Mexico City. I don't know, Tijuana. They say the two cities they know. And I say, no, it was in Los Angeles, right? Oh. It was in East LA. Where a lot of my family lived when they moved to Los Angeles. There's a very big Japanese American community that lived in that Mexican barrio. That's where my family lived. I have a lot of relatives that are buried there in Evergreen Cemetery. And so, the transnational dimensions, often begin for a lot of people just with thinking about the magazine, the newspaper of the PLM that was published in Los Angeles.
One question. You have a chapter on Alexandra Kollontai, the wife of Lenin, and the first ambassador from the USSR to Mexico. We looked at the roots of Mexican Revolution in Haiti. How about going 7 years after to 1917 and tell about Alejandra Kollontai and her tenure as ambassador from Russia, or from what we call Russia now, what used to be called the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. So just one quick clarification. So Alexandra Kollontai was a self-described Bolshevik feminist. She was one of the first women to ever hold a state cabinet position in any government. She served as the social welfare czar under Lenin. And, as many people noted, was enough of an operator that she stayed alive, far into the existence of the USSR. She was not married to Lenin, though. That's Krupskaya. She was, but she worked very closely with Lenin as part of the left opposition. And there's a part in the book where I talk a lot about how, interestingly enough, her writings, along with Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin, I think offer this feminist grounding, a foundational grounding for internationalism that I think also helps us understand Lenin's own position in coming to Bolshevism in a different way. So, Kollontai is a kind of weird figure, when people think about internationalism and the Mexican Revolution. When I would talk to people, they would all start writing the book for me. They would say, oh, of course, you're going to write about Trotsky. Oh, of course, you're going to write about Eisenstein. Oh, of course, you're going to talk about, Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco, and how they were internationalists, right? And, Kollontai kind of comes in. So there's a great, tide of internationalism, during the revolution, that's sort of in full flush from the revolution that, like, honestly, the Salma Hayek's film Frida, I think, really captures and romanticizes. You get a sense of Frida Kahlo, you get a sense of Rivera bringing Trotsky in, escaping, the Stalinist repression, and Siqueiros attempting his life. So for a lot of people, the way they imagine internationalism related to the Mexican Revolution is very much of that period. So arguably, thinking about Kollontai is thinking about the period just after. It's not quite the same ferment. It's not quite the same excitement and exuberance. There are, El Machete, the radical paper of the PCM, used to be produced from the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, right? So Kollontai comes in, and she's, I have a lot to say about Kollontai, and luckily I wrote a whole chapter about it, so I won't give you every twist and turn, but I will say this. Kollontai, in a sense, was exiled to Mexico to be the diplomat in Mexico. She had served as an ambassador before, so this was not out of step with what she knew how to do. But some people think that it was because of her participation with Lenin and others in the left opposition that she was persona non grata. And, so she was sent to Mexico. But what was so interesting for me was to think about a woman who had served in a state cabinet position, who had to think very hard about what it meant to think about a state building itself after revolution, after Civil War, and to think about what that state would look like. So some of her charge was to think about the people that are often left out in the way that we imagine society, right? So this is not the kind of, heterosexual normative nuclear family. She had to think about the orphans. She had to think about divorced mothers. She had to think about the elderly, the disabled, people who are war wounded, people who often, in the United States, end up suffering the most. Just they fall through the cracks in terms of how our, social nets are organized. So she, as a feminist, had to think differently about the construction of the state. So what I was really interested in was thinking with this woman as she's going through Mexico in 1926, which is engaged in some of its own processes. There's a lot of really interesting ideas that people have about what shape the state will take. So I'm interested in both the really exuberant conversations that she's having with radicals and feminists in Mexico, and also the incredibly disappointing conversations that she's having against very conservative elements, both in Mexico, throughout the Americas, in the Caribbean, and particularly in the United States, that don't want to hear anything about anything that she's saying. So that's the kind of nature of the chapter, and it's called How to Make Love, because I'm really trying to organize everything through her concept of comrade love, where she thought if we could organize society on the basis of comrade love instead of property love, we might have a fighting chance of a better world.
What an interesting distinction. I'm sure we would love to hear more of Christina's work. The Okinawan immigrant militant Paul Shinsei Kochi, M.N. Roy, the Indian militant revolutionary, and Dorothy Healy of California. There are many, many jewels in this book by Christina, and we have her in person here. So please, the floor is open. Please make use of her presence to ask any question you have about the Mexican Revolution.
Please, Miju.
Hi,
Hi.
great to see you again, Christina. Just to people, we did interview Christina for the Mexico Solidarity bulletins as well, and it was wonderful to talk with her. I'm wondering about convergent spaces today. I think that was just a really great concept that you introduced there, and how in those spaces people really learned from each other and developed almost new ideas and practices. So now we're in this digital age and we have a lot more places where we can converge, and yet it seems like internationalism is almost less present than it was in those days. So I just wondered, you know, what you're thinking about current convergent spaces, and are there things that we're missing that we could be using more, or is the digital platforms just too capitalist constructed to really be useful? Yeah, just wondering about your thoughts on today.
That's absolutely the question to ask, and I really appreciate it. And I would actually be curious to hear from all of you, you know, because it seems like there's a lot of people on this call that are invested in injecting an internationalist consciousness into social movements today, which, you know, have become quite specialized. It feels like it was not long ago where there was a sense of, you know, I mean, I was just talking to some organizers in New York who were saying there was no contradiction in terms of being able to say you were against the prison industrial complex, and you were also against the war on terror, and you were also against globalization, and that, you know, that did not seem out of place at all. And somehow some of that consciousness seems to have dissipated. So, you know, I'd be very curious in thinking with you all about, you know, how we can inject that. As to the question about convergent spaces today, I wanted to say this, which is that I recently went to the Highlander Folk School, Center for Research and Education in Tennessee, and actually got trapped there during a storm. So, you know, it was just supposed to be a short visit,
yeah.
And then all of these dark clouds started rolling over, the power went out. So what was supposed to be a short visit ended up being a very long afternoon, and I got to talk, you know, to somebody who had been there for a long time. And she said, well, how wonderful is this? Nobody has their phones. We're just talking. It's like the old days. And she made this really important insight where she said, you know, she talked about how people made pilgrimages to the place, how there was a lot of, you know, sense of how sacred the place was, which, you know, I mean, I wouldn't have been there if I didn't believe that. But she said, Highlander isn't the place. Highlander is the people. Highlander is what comes out of Highlander. And I've just really been chewing on this because I think that's how I'm thinking about convergent spaces. You know, like when I first circulated a draft, an older organizer said, this is probably the most important thing that you're representing, because you're not talking necessarily about radical spaces that are buildings or institutions. You know, oftentimes our movement spends a lot of time thinking that that's the, you know, the primary thing. If we could just get a building, a space, you know, like enough money to do this thing in perpetuity, then the revolution happens. And he said, you know, the fact that you're talking about such mutable spaces, the fact that you're giving a name to the kind of organizing that happens in prisons, the kind of organizing that happens within farm worker strikes, the kind of organizing that happens among artists, you know, that's really valuable because it helps us give a name to things that are already happening all the time, but we don't always realize. So, you know, yes, obviously, like we're all talking to each other. We're sitting in different places. You know, I'm in Hartford, Connecticut. You know, I wish I could be in the same physical space as all of you. And the pandemic has, you know, really shown us like it's a valuable tool for being able to share space when we can't physically share space. But, it no more than any school, than any labor hall, than any prison, there's no guarantees that a certain physical space or the internet, can facilitate the kind of radical convergences. But I think that this is just, for me, convergent spaces is something that necessarily comes together in the process of organizing, where people have to draw on where they come from, what they know, how they imagine change, compare notes with other people, and figure out how are you going to fight the thing ahead of you. So convergent space for me is, it's more mutable. There's potential in any place where people are fighting. So sometimes that's the internet, and sometimes it is definitely not social media.
Thanks, Christina. That sounds like Susan Williams, was it?
Yes. Yes. Everybody knows Susan.
I was on their board for a while.
Oh, how wonderful. It's a small world.
Yeah.
There's a hand up over here.
Hi, Bruce and Norma. Who wants to go first?
Bruce.
You're on mute, Bruce.
Take your mute off, Bruce.
Thank you, Norma, for telling me. Great to see you, Christina,
Great to see
as
you.
always. I'd like to just ask a kind of a challenging question, not necessarily to you, but just throw out a question. And that is that right now, I think that for much of the US left today, there's a problem in seeing Mexico as somehow different in terms of what international solidarity should be. I mean, just looking at the threats against Mexico by the Republicans and the weak, and I'll say chicken shit response by the Democrats in response to those threats is barely challenged by the US left. A little bit here and there, but it's like Mexico, oh yeah, that's that. But and I don't mean to draw like this kind of a comparison about when or where is solidarity legitimate and when is it less legitimate. That's not the point. But why is solidarity with Mexico considered or not considered as critical as is solidarity with, for example, Palestine or the Syrian revolution? And that's just kind of a challenging question that I would put out to anyone in the left, particularly the US left.
Yeah, that's absolutely the question to ask. I mean, I find that there's a lot of kind of insufferable conversations when people talk about how do we define the struggle before us and how do we think about it in relationship to fascism? Because there are some people who pull out the encyclopedia and then try to say, well, no, fascism is according to, and here's the criteria, and therefore it hasn't met all the criteria. It's like this checklist type of argumentation. When I think anybody who is thinking about police violence, who's thinking about border violence, who's thinking about the US's relationship to Mexico, like they don't need an encyclopedia. I mean, this whole country, particularly the left, should be absolutely scandalized that at this past week's Republican presidential, debate, there were a number of candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy, Ron DeSantis, who tried to define their bona fides by essentially promoting overtly fascist practices in relationship to Mexico. And that should give everybody pause. DeSantis thought he was going to get a big, and apologies for anybody who's not in the weeds on this, but Ron DeSantis, who's, just a worm of a man, who's the governor of Florida, said that, on his first day as president, were he to be elected, he would send special forces into Mexico and, and kept repeating the phrase, like in cold blood or something, that he was going to assassinate people. And Mexico in particular has just obsessed the right wing and reactionary imagination in the US. I think you're absolutely right. It's a big puzzle why there isn't more of a thrust to just confront and defend that. It also feels like something that, it wasn't too long ago. I mean, I don't know if I'm somewhat biased because I grew up in California. So any, the way I learned internationalism was in relationship to labor solidarity with Mexican workers. It was in relationship to the Zapatistas and indigenous people in Mexico. Like, you couldn't talk about any of the things you were fighting about in the world or in the country without thinking about Mexico. And now I absolutely agree. Somehow that tendency, that consciousness of Mexico has somewhat disappeared, and we very much need it back.
So,
That's
I'm
great.
sorry.
Just to
Sure.
follow up on that. That's something that continually in interviews that we've done, like with you for the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin, we talk about this all the time. It's a question. It really is. Hey, Norma.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. You mentioned the Highlander and trying to spread the idea, we don't need a place in particular. I read The Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrow, and I got the sensation that everything's been going on with people ever since people got here, which is 100,000 years, 200,000 years, they're not sure. And that these things are not dissimilar on a century by century basis, but they're the same in a sense, in a very general sense. As far as the details, of course, there's other things to say. So the places are important to people, and not to be dismissed. I think of Highlander, I never had anything. I mean, I found out about it late in my life, actually. I found out everything. My folks were communists, but I'm third generation, so were my grandparents. But it's taken time for me to find out. I've always felt that I'm communist. I've always been dedicated to it. I've always tried to work in it. I've always been borderline. We went to Israel to help build the socialist-based nation, help the desert bloom, because we were so badly educated that we ended up doing that and then leaving, of course. So I've always been trying to fix everything in a very, very communist way, very cooperative and people together. So that you can't leave out place. Now, this comes to the looking at left resistance to actually including the perspectives that we want to see. This thing about Ukraine, the US just made another inroad against any semblance, any remains of the Bolshevik Revolution. It got in to go through Ukraine against Russia. I mean, the United States, once the thing began, was slavering to have a war, another war. And because people don't get it, what we're about this whole composite of building this, retaining the strong revolution. And
Norma, do you have a question?
And in fact, the communist event has been going on throughout the world ever since the Bolshevik Revolution.
Go ahead. Say it again.
Do you have a question for Christina, Norma?
Other people do.
Other people may.
Well, I can respond to some of what you put on the table, Norma, if that's okay. So I will say first off that I don't believe that Putin sees himself in line with the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, he explicitly—
It's beside the point, yeah.
I mean, it talks about the Mexican Revolution, but I do think that, he pretty firmly aligns himself with an imperialist vision of Russia that's
Not
in
really.
his talks.
Not really.
But I think your first point, I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I appreciate you bringing up Graeber and the importance of place, because I absolutely believe it. And by bringing up the Highlander example, I'm not trying to say that place is not important, but I'm just saying that not everything, places are without guarantees. And so if we think about who makes the places, what sort of collaborations produce, collective power, I feel like that's the emphasis. And I really appreciated the first point that you made about, the dawn of everything, and how, there are ways that people have behaved for a very long time, and we can look for models of cooperation, that long precede the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century, we can go eons back. And it was actually something that I learned spending time in Appalachia, spending time with people who are opposing the construction of prisons right now, because they are often the same people that opposed mountaintop removal, that were organizers in huge environmental rights activities before that, and were people who opposed the domination of coal and the kind of policing that happens with coal towns, people who see themselves in a lineage of the great mining wars and the great labor organizing that happened in that region. And it was so powerful to be there. And the sense that I got while I was there was that people through struggle have retained something that a lot of people in this country have lost, which is that memory of, like you said, how people can be with each other, how they can collaborate, how they can fight, and how they can, win new worlds. And their vision of the future is very much grounded in a long history of the past. And, I feel like that's part of the reason I wrote the book, because I believe that too.
I'd like to
Bob,
pick,
I have a question.
And a very good book it is.
I'm going to finish my question. We've been challenged to get out of our expat heads and protest against our government in the United States, against threatening Mexico, where we are glad to be hosted and welcomed, with invasion. Thank you for raising that question, Bruce, and our comrade from Mexico Solidarity. It's altogether pertinent. And if we did circulate a protest among the expats in Mexico, of which there are many, would you be interested in signing it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes,
Of
oh,
course.
good. I see
Oh,
one hand,
absolutely.
thank you. So I will do that if for no other person besides this one here. Thank you, sir. Well, it's just outrageous, to say nothing of unneighborly, to allow our hosts to be insulted and threatened by the Imperium to the north. So thank you for suggesting that, Bruce, and our comrade from Mexico Solidarity. Okay, go ahead.
30 years or so ago, Bob and I started studying the cooperative at Mondragon in the Basque Country of Spain. And 30 years ago, people on the left were looking very much towards a renovation or renewal of the labor movement and the trade union movement. And can you, oh, okay. And finally, now we're seeing a great deal of convergence precisely between the labor movement and the self-management or cooperative movement. And we've been instrumental in helping push that along through the workers' economy, which was started in Buenos Aires back in 2007. And we've found that there is, we're coming together, the self-management cooperative movement is being far more accepted by the labor union movement and vice versa. And so we can come together to struggle for either worker ownership, worker control, of producer enterprises. And I think that's a very significant area of convergence, and it's not a place. It's movements, it's social movements that are happening around the world. And when we think back, the Bolshevik Revolution started with an emphasis on cooperative self-management. I mean, Bolshevik means worker control. Soviet means worker control. The Algerian Revolution focused on worker control. The Cuban Revolution, a number of revolutions around have. And I just wanted to comment that I think that's another area of convergence where people are coming together to learn from the struggles that we've all been working in our own little corner, and bringing them together. And there seems to be a real coming together of lots of different struggles right now, which is wonderful. And it's something that we desperately need.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I would really love to hear more about your work and how it's evolved, as of late. In the United States, we're certainly seeing this profound resurgence of a labor consciousness that you can both see in mass unionization efforts and labor organizing. And then to a lesser extent, but certainly in profound ways, the establishment of co-ops, worker-owned co-ops. In fact, some of the places that have been the most receptive to me in this book have been, worker-owned co-op bookstore, coffee shops, things like that. And I think they would absolutely co-sign everything that you just said, that this is emblematic of, this is at least the kind of base from which we can think about power differently, right? So not just what can we do within a workplace that we don't own, but what changes in the conversation about how we control our time, our labor, the wealth that's produced from it. So yeah, I mean, all I can say is yes. and I certainly hope to learn more about your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Bob, do you want to draw things to a close?
Sure.
Before that happens,
Thank you
can
so
I,
much, Christina.
can I,
Bob
Right.
has a few closing comments.
can I
Well,
remind
I
people
just
that
want to thank
Hugo
Christina for awakening
Hugo
us
Chavez was not
to this
communist.
ongoing
when he
awakening
began.
to the Mexican Revolution and to its predecessor in Haiti. There used to be a slogan, "South to Freedom," among the slaves in the South of the United States, because Mexico had much less market and people of that era. So I want to thank you, dear Christina, and ask you to be ready to come back in another year and tell us more about your work, which is so interesting to us and so in line with our concerns here. Thank you very, very much. Can we give her a hand?
It's been such an honor to speak with you all. Thank you for making the time, and thank you for this really generous invitation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good.
Well,
Yes.
that's it. I'm going to sign us all off. Thank you for coming. We will be back 2 weeks from today on Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time, and with a group therapy about the mess we're all in, personally as well as politically. Thank you very much.
Okay, Christina, be in touch.
Hope to see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Bob.